Question number 2, the Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister of Health. What recent reports has he received this year on access to rural health services?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, I've received a range of reports, mostly positive, about improved access to health services in rural communities, including positive reports about the voluntary bonding scheme introduced by this government, which has seen more than 800 extra health professionals work in hard-to-staff communities. However, there always remains more that can be done.
Mr Speaker.
A supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
If rural communities are getting their fair share of the health budget, why did the President of the Royal New Zealand College of GPs, Dr Tim Malloy, who comes from the rural chapter and has a wealth of experience, looked at the budget and said, "I'm disappointed. It's unclear what they think we do." And we have heard the rhetoric around integrated care, but the investment isn't being made.
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, I talk to Dr Malloy regularly, and we both agree that district health boards are well funded and have the responsibility for distributing funds to ensure that rural communities receive the funds that they require to deliver the services needed by those communities.
Supplementary question, Barbara Stewart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What is the total amount of new money allocated to rural health services from Budget 2015, so that, as previously stated by the Minister, and I quote, "all New Zealanders and their families have access to timely quality health care no matter where they live"?
Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, there's $403 million of new money in the budget, $320 million that goes to DHBs, and it's up to those DHBs to make decisions about how they distribute those funds to the communities they serve.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
If rural communities are receiving their fair share of the health budget and are having their health needs met, why have 1,700 people in the small towns of Wanaka, Cromwell and Alexandra attended unprecedented meetings since the late 1990s to express their anger at the government's lack of funding for rural health?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, I don't think those meetings are about a lack of funding. They're about ensuring that the right services are provided to those communities, and I can tell you that the population-based funding formula is the same formula that previous governments have used to distribute funding across the country.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
What was his response to the letter he received from representatives at the meeting in Alexandra, which said, quote, "We have resolved a vote of no confidence in yourself as Minister of Health. What? The funding of health services is ultimately your responsibility. You decide with your Cabinet colleagues on priorities. Quite clearly, 26 million on the New Zealand flag is far more important than using it for rural health services." And by the way, it passed unanimously by 1,000 people.
The Honourable Dr
Well, Mr
Jonathan
Speaker,
Coleman.
my response was I got straight on the phone to the gentleman who proposed that notice of no confidence. I told him I wasn't going to resign. He laughed. We talked through some of the issues, and he accepted that there are some real challenges there, which the government is committed to facing up to and solving.
Question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Has he been told that the Southern District Health Board intends to push ahead with their cuts of 5% across the small rural health centres, according to their latest board minutes, which will lead to a 50% inpatient beds being closed and the closure of the high dependency unit at Dunstan and the loss of nearby acute cardiac care at Wanaka?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, Mr Speaker, I've got very clear expectations of the Southern District Health Board, and they know that they have to provide the services required by those communities within the budget that's been allocated to them.
Question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette.
Isn't it rather pathetic for him and the local member to blame the DHB for mismanagement when taxpayers have been paying for intensive monitoring by the government-appointed Crown Monitor since 2010, 5 years of intensive monitoring? When do you stop blaming the DHB and take responsibility?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, Mr Speaker, what I think is rather pathetic is that we've got the ex-minister from 10 years ago who was very much involved in the problems that occurred in Southland and Otago, who provoked a response from 45 GPs writing to the board in 2007, expressing their display at the Labor government's abysmal performance, and quite frankly, we're still left picking up the pieces that Annette King left behind.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
Point of order,
Order.
Mr Speaker.
Order. A point of order has been raised. It will be
I
heard.
seek leave to table a Jonathan Coleman speech in the estimates debate 2007, Mr
Order.
Speaker.
No, the member will
When-
resume her seat immediately. Immediately. That is not a point.
Mr Speaker?
This is a fresh point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker.
Fresh
I
point.
notice in the answer that you allowed the minister to raise when I was minister in 2007.
Order. The member
In fact,
will
I wasn't.
resume her seat. And I remind her to have a look at her question she asked, which led off, isn't this pathetic? That gave the minister a very wide avenue to respond. He took it. Order. The member then is using a point of order to table a Hansard. A speech that was made. That is freely available to all members if they want to bother to look it up. Some might, I doubt whether many will. Question number 3, Andrew Bailey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, as part of the government's wider economic plan, how will Budget 2015 help families and businesses in